They were never meant to find the chamber. The workmen had been told only to level the hill for a schoolhouse, to clear the remnants of a chapel that had burned long before their grandfathers were born. But the first strike of the shovel rang against stone, hollow, deliberate, like a bell answering from underground. When they pried the boards away, when they lit the lanterns and descended beneath the former pulpit, they did not find earth, nor cellar, nor foundation. They found benches, 7 of them, carved not for prayer, but for witnessing, each marked with a single word, witness, and the air. The air was not stale, not dead with the rot of years. No, the men swore the air was listening. This is the hollow at Baird's Cross, a place buried not because it was forgotten, but because it was remembered too well. What happened there was not written into the history of eastern Tennessee, not in the county ledgers, not in the church records, not even in the whispered stories passed from grandparent to child. It was bricked up, silenced, erased. But the land did not forget. The soil holds its own record, and when the workers struck stone, they opened a mouth that had been sealed shut for nearly a century. To understand the hollow, you must go back to 1838, when the chapel of Baird's Cross stood on the hill like a warning that no one would name. It was a modest building, white pine beams, stone foundation, a single bell that tolled not for joy but for order. This was no wealthy parish, it was an outpost, a tether of ritual in a land still clawed at by wilderness. Families gathered there not because they believed, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't. At the center was Elder Isaiah Harrow, a man of scripture, yes, but more than that, a man whose voice carried like a hammer through the ribs. He was not loved, he was not kind, but he was listened to, and in those mountains, where silence spreads like infection, being listened to meant power. Harrow wore black in summer. He slept little. He spoke of hell, but not the kind found after death. He warned of the earth itself opening, swallowing the wicked, silencing their names. At first his words felt like metaphor, but in time people wondered if Harrow was not warning them, if he was preparing them, because Harrow was not merely a preacher. He was a warden. And the chapel was not merely a house of God. It was a lock. The first disappearance was explained away as wandering. A trapper turned sexton found the doors unlatched one sleeting night, the sanctuary colder than winter should allow. On the altar, there was no Bible, no cross, only a hymn book, waterlogged to the point of illegibility, and a shovel. Its blade rusted, but its handle wet with dark earth, as though it had been used only hours before. Elder Harrow was gone. No body, no tracks, no farewell. The sheriff, a practical man, wrote the line that still survives in fading ink. He left not through will but through means unnatural, or through space not yet known to this world. For that he was ridiculed, his words stricken from state records, yet the silence of the chapel deepened. People said the rafters felt heavier as though pressing down on them. They heard footsteps when no one walked. And when Harrow's replacement, Reverend Abram Chase, took the pulpit, the silence did not break. It sharpened. It is always in the silence where corruption takes root. Not the corruption of money or flesh, but the corruption of structure, of rituals built to hide what cannot be spoken. Chase extended the sermons. He forbade song. He turned confession into spectacle, public and shaming. And most of all, he forbade anyone from crossing the pulpit rail. The altar was no longer theirs to approach. "The boundary is not mine either," he said. "I simply hold it." Think about those words. Think about what it means when a leader tells his flock that he is not the master, only the gatekeeper. Gatekeeper to what? To whom? The hollow was not a place for prayer. It was containment. Witness benches carved not for worshippers but for observers, observers of what lay beneath. The soil did not just absorb footsteps, it remembered. And when the hymns changed, when the voices fell into unison, tones stripped of melody, when even humming was forbidden, the parishioners were not worshipping. They were pacifying something, feeding silence so that it would not rise. But silence does not remain silence forever. It waits, it measures, It presses itself into the marrow of those who live above it until they too become part of the ritual. Women were brought to the chapel called the Unbound, their hair shaved, their names erased. They were made to sit in the back, never to speak, and when they vanished, transferred to Knox Hollow, renamed invalids, or simply swallowed by the census. Nobody asked why, because to ask was to invite the silence to notice you, and that is the truth of institutions, isn't it? They do not need to hide their corruption behind walls of secrecy. They only need to train you not to ask. They only need to teach you that the silence is sacred, that questioning is blasphemy, that unease is a lack of faith. The chapel at Baird's Cross was not unique. It was simply one face of the same structure that appears everywhere: church, court, state, school. Different names, same silence, and beneath them all, something waiting. When the workers struck stone in 1881, they did not merely uncover a forgotten room. They cracked the lid on a truth buried so deep the county itself tried to erase it. And if you think this is only a story of the past, if you think this is only about a small-town chapel in eastern Tennessee, you're not listening. Because the Hollow is not just a place, it's a pattern. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. By the spring of 1840, Reverend Abram Chase had tightened his grip. At first, the changes seemed like discipline, a stricter schedule, longer sermons, more emphasis on confession. But discipline has a way of bending into ritual, and ritual has a way of concealing something far older than doctrine. The town had no idea what they were participating in. They believed they were worshipping God. They believed their obedience was a form of faith. But in truth, they were being drafted into a structure of containment, one designed not for their salvation but for their silence. Chase never once spoke of Elder Harrow. He never acknowledged the man's disappearance, nor the shovel, nor the strange note that had been found in Harrow's desk. The foundation is not ours. We only speak where the floor allows. Instead, Chase pressed forward as though nothing had happened. Yet every Sunday, every Wednesday night without fail, he would pause before the altar, not in prayer, but as if he were listening. His hand would rest on the wood, his eyes closed, and the congregation swore they felt the air change. Breath came harder. The silence stretched. It was as though the room itself was waiting for permission to exhale. The pulpit rail became a boundary not just of wood but of fear. No child dared cross it. Mothers hushed their infants when they cried near the front pews. And then came the cabinet, a tall, narrow structure installed behind the pulpit where once there had only been wall. It was sealed, nailed shut, no handle, no latch. A child later recalled being forced to walk past it in silence, one by one, as the Reverend told them, "You must learn where you end." It is here that we glimpse the true nature of the Hollow. This was not worship. This was instruction. The people of Baird's Cross were being taught to accept limits without explanation, to kneel before a silence that gave them nothing in return, to fear the floor itself. And fear, once taught, becomes self-sustaining. You do not need bars when the mind supplies them. You do not need chains when silence alone will hold. But fear alone was not enough. Chase introduced the practice of collective confession, not whispered to him in private, but spoken aloud before the entire congregation. Men admitted sins they had never dared voice. Women wept in public shame. Children stammered through punishments for thoughts they barely understood. All of it spoken into the rafters, spoken into the air, spoken into the silence beneath the floor. Do you understand what that means? Confession was no longer about forgiveness, it was about feeding. Each word given freely, each secret dragged into light, did not cleanse. It bound. Chase himself admitted as much in his surviving notes. We do not confess because God demands it. We confess because the floor must know us. The floor must know us. What kind of church teaches that salvation is dependent not on heaven, but on the ground beneath your feet? What kind of faith demands that every word, every shame, every hidden thought be poured into the soil itself? Soon, even sound itself became suspect. Humming was forbidden. Singing was stripped of melody, flattened into drone-like tones that echoed but never rose. The congregation was warned not to whisper within the walls. A little girl wrote to her cousin, "Mama says the walls can hear now." Once she dropped her glove near the front and didn't pick it up. She says something behind the altar moved when she reached. The walls can hear now. The floor must know us. The boundary is not mine. I simply hold it. These are not the words of faith. These are the words of control. They reveal a system designed to break the will and bend the mind, to convince people that the silence was not only listening, but judging. And in judgment, it was not God they feared. It was something else, something older. By 1842, many of the original parishioners had left. They could not stand the heaviness in the air, the endless sermons, the public humiliations, but others replaced them. Laborers drawn from nearby farms, widows seeking community, children sent from poor houses to be molded. Chase called these new arrivals the unbound. They were not given voices. They sat at the back, heads shaved, silent. They were witnesses, though to what, no one would say. The chapel's records show structural changes during this time. The tax ledgers note floor opening reinforced, interior modified, containment expenditure. No builders were listed, no invoices filed. Work was done at night. A stained glass window of red and violet was added, not behind the altar, but along the western wall, low to the ground, so that light struck sideways, crawling across the floor like blood. Chase said, "Light must not come from behind the word. It must arrive laterally, as judgment does." Every detail speaks of design. Not the design of a humble chapel, but the design of a chamber. Reinforced floors, hidden cabinets, rules against sound, collective confessions fed into silence. Witnesses seated in the back, silent, nameless, their very identities stripped away. And here is the truth most men refuse to face. Institutions are built not for salvation, but for containment. The hollow at Baird's cross was not a mistake of faith. It was its natural conclusion. Rituals designed to feed what could not be acknowledged, silence weaponized into obedience, shame turned into sustenance. Think of your own life, the institutions you obey, the rules you follow without knowing why. How many of them are boundaries you are told not to cross? How many confessions have you made, at work, in court, in therapy, in prayer, believing they freed you, when in fact they chained you tighter? How many times have you bowed to silence without realizing you were feeding it? The people of Baird's Cross did not realize. They believed they were alone. But they were not. They were the first generation in that town to learn the most dangerous truth. Silence listens. And once it knows you, you cannot take your words back. By the middle of 1843, the chapel at Baird's Cross had become something more than a church. It had become a machine. Every sermon, every pause of breath, every moment of silence was part of a system that no one dared question out loud. And yet, beneath the surface, something was shifting, because silence, once it becomes ritual, is never just silence. It is a mouth, opening. The parishioners felt it first in the floor. Deacon Hollis Clay, whose journals are mostly lost, wrote a line that survives only because his descendants copied it into family records. The floor was warm again today. I do not believe it is sun heat. Think about that. Warmth from beneath the boards, not from fire, not from lanterns, but from something else. The boundaries of the chapel grew stranger. The western stained glass window, the one colored in red and violet, was said to never admit sunlight, even when the morning glare struck it directly. Children whispered that the glass glowed from within, and Chase, always Chase, would stare at that wall in silence, as if it owed him something. But the most sinister changes were not in stone or wood. They were in people. The congregation began to see girls, some local, many from outside the county, brought into the chapel, under Reverend Chase's guidance. They were called the Unbound, their heads shaved, their eyes lowered. They were never asked to sing, never invited to confess. They sat silently at the back, week after week, like offerings that had not yet been spoken. Who were they? Some came from poor houses, traded away by desperate families, others from indenture agreements, their labor purchased under the guise of education. Records suggest at least 19 young women passed through the chapel's orbit between 1844 and 1851. Their names appear briefly in county ledgers, marked first as servants, then abruptly as invalids. And where did they go? Most were transferred to a place few dared speak aloud, Knox Hollow Reformatory for young women. It was called a school, sometimes a house, but in truth it was neither. It was a warehouse for the forgotten. The girls sent there did not return with education. They returned broken, or not at all. The hollow and the chapel fed each other. Those who entered Baird's Cross as unbound were soon after listed at Knox Hollow as inmates, and from there their trails vanish into silence. A note, found in the pocket of a hymn book a century later, believed to be from one such girl, Letty Brand, age 15, tells us everything. He says we must watch the hollow, that we're born to see what others shut their eyes to. We were told not to hum anymore, said it stirred the floor, said it listens best when we cry. What kind of faith tells children not to hum? What kind of church insists that silence must be fed with tears? This was no Christianity. This was containment. The chapel was not built to lift souls upward. It was designed to keep something down. And yet the system spread. The rules multiplied. No humming, no echo, no return. That was Rule 3, posted in the vestibule under the heading, Conduct before the floor. Even visitors were warned not to speak freely, not to whisper, not to let their words bounce into the rafters unbidden. Parishioners learned that even their thoughts felt heavier near the pulpit, as if the silence itself was pressing against their skulls. Imagine being one of those girls, shaved, stripped of song, forced to sit at the back and watch the congregation bow to silence. Imagine being sent away to Knox Hollow, told you were invalid, told you no longer belonged to yourself, and imagine the final horror, that your pain, your cries, your very voice were not wasted, they were used, they were fed into the earth itself. This is how institutions operate when they are at their most corrupt. They do not need to strike you down with violence. They convince you to submit, to walk willingly into silence, to believe obedience is survival. They convince communities to sacrifice their weakest, not with swords, not with whips, but with paperwork, with rules, with ritual. Baird's Cross and Knox Hollow were not separate. They were the same machine, one built above ground, one buried in shadow. And when Bishop Elias Gray came from Nashville in 1851, even he could sense it. His report to the presbytery is chilling. The sanctuary at Baird's Cross is doctrinally sound, but structurally in violation. There is a chill beneath the altar. The pulpit should be relocated, if not rebuilt. The placement encourages unhealthy reverence of a fixed point. Congregants show signs of ritual anxiety and over-silencing. Over-silencing. The phrase alone suggests that what happened there was more than fear. It was conditioning. It was psychological control, the kind that bends generations into obedience without ever raising a whip. Of course, Bishop Gray's visit was never recorded in the chapel's official ledgers. He was erased. The hollow erases everything it cannot use. By 1852, 5 more young women had been sent to Knox Hollow. 3 died there. 2 were released without families to claim them. Their names never spoken in church again. And still the pews remained full. Still the silence deepened. Still Reverend Chase preached not from the Bible, but from a small notebook, the one he kept folded inside his robe. Parishioners said it contained no words, only curved lines, like ribs drawn as music. One boy claimed he peeked at the pages during communion. He said they looked like measures of song, but bent wrong, twisted into shapes that no hymn could carry. The boy's name vanished from chapel attendance records that same year. So ask yourself, what were they feeding? What was it that silence contained if it demanded voices, tears, even lives? And why has no one spoken of it since? Because here is the truth you were never meant to hear. Institutions don't bury their darkest secrets in books, they bury them in people. In silence, in rituals that seem harmless until you see what they've been protecting all along. And when silence is fed long enough, it does not stay still. It waits, it grows, it begins to want more. By the dawn of the 1850s, the hollow no longer hid itself beneath the chapel floor. It began to push outward, through wood, through stone, through people. What had once been contained was now seeping, and the town of Baird's Cross was changing with it. The first signs were architectural. Parishioners noted cracks forming in the chapel's stone foundation, small at first, then spreading like veins across the base. The altar platform groaned as if under pressure, knots in the wood blistering outward like boils. The stained glass window, that violet-red aberration Chase had placed in the western wall, refused to admit light even on the brightest days. Farmers swore they saw it glowing at night, not with reflected fire, but with something like breath. The deacons wrote careful notes. Repairs were logged, panel reinforcement, vault trimming, floor stabilization, always at night, always unrecorded in official permits, and always with one phrase attached: containment justified. Containment of what? No one dared to say. But the people felt it. They felt it in their bones. Parishioners wrote in their diaries of air that thickened as you neared the pulpit, of breath that came slower as though lungs were weighed down. Mothers wrote that children grew restless during service, not from boredom but from dread. And then came the silences, those stretches of time in which Chase would stop mid-sermon, bow his head and listen, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for nearly an hour. The congregation sat frozen, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe, because in those pauses something else seemed to be listening too. And the more the silence deepened, the more the town itself changed. Attendance at the chapel grew, not from devotion but compulsion. Families who had sworn never to return found themselves drawn back week after week, unable to explain why. One farmer wrote, "I feel the pull on Sundays like tidewater. My body goes through, my mind resists. It is not choice, it is gravity. That is how psychological control works. You think you are free, that your will is yours. But institutions know better. They do not need your belief. They only need your obedience. And obedience, once ingrained, becomes indistinguishable from desire. You think you want to attend. You think you choose to kneel. But you are only echoing what silence has demanded all along." The disappearances continued. More girls taken from farms, indentures, poorhouses, moved to Knox Hollow, renamed invalids, erased from record. When families asked questions, they were told the girls had been placed into education, that they would return with scripture in their hearts. But they did not return. A folded hymn card discovered decades later bore their final truth: "He watches not from heaven, but from beneath. We are the roof to his cage." Even the hymns themselves shifted. Gone were the psalms of comfort, of salvation, of glory. In their place came new verses, anonymous and unsettling. Beneath the tongue the soil waits. Beneath the pew the name takes shape. Speak not in rhythm nor in grace. Let silence be thy resting place. Who wrote these words? They appear in no hymnals, no church records, no regional songbooks. Yet the people sang them flat and tuneless, their voices drained of melody. They believed they were praising God. In truth, they were feeding the floor. By 1851, even outsiders began to notice. Bishop Elias Gray's visit confirmed what locals already felt but refused to admit. His report spoke of ritual anxiety, of unhealthy reverence for a fixed point beneath the altar, of congregants showing signs of over-silencing. He warned that the pulpit should be relocated, that the structure itself encouraged unnatural fixation, but his visit was erased from church records. His warnings were ignored, and months later his name vanished from presbytery minutes entirely. You see the pattern, don't you? Every warning is silenced, every witness erased, every boundary crossed by the hollow becomes normalized until no one remembers it was different. That is how corruption endures, not through violence but through silence. Not through sudden shock, but through slow, relentless conditioning. By 1852, the Hollow claimed more lives. 3 girls died in Knox Hollow. 2 were discharged, nameless, with no families to take them back. Deacon Clay fell ill, his final letters speaking of hymns heard from beneath the floor, hymns that had not yet been written. He wrote, "Someone is practicing it wrong, someone who knows the verses we haven't written yet. What does it mean when silence sings back? What does it mean when hymns echo from below, out of time, out of history?" By then the town no longer resisted. The chapel was full each Sunday. Pews sanded smooth, family names eras. Said. A rope stretched permanent across the pulpit stairs. The people had been reshaped. Their obedience was complete. And still the air thickened, still the floor warmed, still Chase stood with his hand on the altar, head bowed, listening. The hollow had grown beyond the chapel. It had become the town's rhythm, its breath, its pulse. Men worked the fields but thought of the floor. Women hushed their children, warning them not to whisper. The silence had become sacred, not by faith, but by fear. And once fear is sanctified, it becomes indistinguishable from worship. The question is not why the people obeyed. The question is why they were taught to believe they had a choice at all. Because that is how every great institution operates. whether chapel or court, school or state. They build their foundations not on faith, not on freedom, but on silence. And once silence knows your name, once it has taken your words, you can never unbind yourself from it. And so the hollow waited. The chapel remained standing, the pews remained filled, but beneath it all, the silence had grown hungry, and hunger does not wait forever. By the mid-1850s, the hollow was no longer confined to the chapel floor. Its influence had seeped into the homes, the fields, the very rhythm of life in eastern Tennessee. It is easy to imagine the hollow as a place, a room, a foundation, a hidden chamber beneath the pulpit. But it was never just that. It was a pattern, an infection, a structure that could spread into every corner of the community once people surrendered their voices, and by this point, most had. The town itself reflected the corruption. Families who once painted their shutters bright began leaving them bare. The laughter of children in fields faded, replaced with a cautious quiet, as though joy itself might draw notice. Even livestock grew uneasy near the chapel hill, refusing to graze along the Westers' one slope. Diaries from the time mention chickens that would not roost, dogs that would not cross the road near the chapel gate, and horses that shied violently when forced up the path. It was as if the animals recognized what the people had trained themselves to ignore. But the most chilling evidence lay in Knox Hollow, the so-called reformatory where the unbound girls were sent. Officially, it was a place of correction, designed to instill discipline and piety. In truth, it was a warehouse of silence, a holding ground for offerings no one wanted to name. Testimonies are scarce, most destroyed, but fragments survive in hidden letters, scraps of hymn pages, and oral histories whispered decades later. One such fragment, written in pencil on the back of a hymn sheet, is believed to have come from Letty Brand, the 15-year-old girl sent there in 1845. Her words are brittle, nearly illegible, but they reveal everything. He says the hollow is listening. He says we are chosen to watch it because we are born unbound. We must not hum, we must not sing, we must only cry, for it listens best when we cry. Imagine that. Young girls forbidden even the smallest sound of comfort, taught that their tears were not weakness but duty, food for something beneath the soil. What kind of doctrine is that? What kind of institution convinces children that their suffering is sacred? This is where the illusion of faith dissolves and the machinery of control is laid bare. The chapel was never about God. Knox Hollow was never about reformation. Both were instruments in a system designed to harvest silence, to feed it, to keep it alive. And the proof is found not only in testimony but in architecture. Tax records from 1847 list unusual expenditures, panel repairs, floor reinforcement, vault trimming, all performed at night, all unpermitted. The records cite Article 8, containment, that are shares. Like Elder Harrow's disappearance, like every piece of evidence that pointed to what the hollow truly was, containment. Think about that word. Churches are built to save, not contain. To lift souls upward, not to bury something beneath them. Yet here was a system pouring money, time, and secrecy into fortifying a floor, into silencing a chamber, into ensuring that whatever lay beneath the pulpit did not return. And still the silence grew restless. Parishioners described hearing hymns from below the boards, hymns they had not yet sung. Women described the air in their homes thickening at night, as if the chapel's silence was bleeding through the walls. Men described waking with soil beneath their fingernails, though they had not left their beds. By the time Deacon Hollis Clay fell ill, he was writing words that should have shattered the illusion forever. Someone is practicing the hymn from below, someone who knows verses we have not written yet. That is not faith. That is not imagination. That is something speaking back. Yet the people did not rise against it. They did not abandon the chapel, nor burn it down, nor demand answers. They continued to attend, to kneel, to confess. Because this is how institutions protect themselves. By convincing you that questioning them is more dangerous than obeying them, fear becomes obedience, obedience becomes worship, worship becomes silence, and silence, once fed, hungers. The unbound girls continued to vanish into Knox Hollow. Records show 19 names across a decade, but there may have been more. Some were listed as dead, others discharged without kin, others simply erased. Their identities were the first sacrifice, their bodies the second, their voices the third. What was all of it for? What was the floor holding? The notes, the hymns, the rules, they all point to the same answer. Something was beneath the chapel, something was me, and to be contained. And it was not God. It was not salvation. It was not even the devil in the sense preachers spoke of. It was older, hungrier, more patient. By 1855, Knox Hollow itself was shuttered under accusations of neglect, abuse, and psychological torment. No investigation followed. The silence swallowed it whole. Families who asked too loudly were reminded of Scripture. Survivors were renamed, married off, or disappeared entirely. The institution folded into shadow, its secrets preserved not by erasure alone, but by ritual silence. And still the chapel at Baird's Cross stood, its pews full, its pulpit roped, its congregation obedient. The silence had bled outward, yes, but the center remained intact, the foundation still held, and if the purpose of an institution is to endure, then Baird's Cross was succeeding. It had trained its people to obey without question, to kneel without voice, to fear silence more than death. But here is the revelation most men cannot face. The Hollow is not unique. It is not a local story, not a quirk of Appalachian history. It is the blueprint. Every institution that thrives on silence, every system that teaches you to confess your weakness but never your strength, every structure that convinces you to obey without explanation, they are all hollows. They all feed something. They all contain what should never be allowed to rise. And if you think you are safe because you live far from eastern Tennessee, if you think this is only a story of 1838, you are already mistaken. The Hollow is not a place, it is a pattern, and it has already reached you. By the late 1850s, the Hollow was no longer content with silence alone. It began to demand more presence, more submission, more lives shaped in its image. Entire families were bent around its gravity. Sons were raised to confess their every thought before they could speak freely. Daughters were hushed before they could sing. Fathers worked their fields but kept their eyes on the chapel hill as if waiting for its bell to toll. And mothers became the enforcers. They silenced their children before the floor could notice them. They whispered warnings that were not scripture but law. Do not hum. Do not whisper. Do not look too long at the pulpit. This is how power multiplies, not by the hand of the institution alone, but by the people who learn to fear it so deeply they enforce its rules themselves. Chase no longer needed to punish disobedience. The community did it for him, and in that, the Hollow revealed its greatest weapon. Obedience disguised as tradition, but still, hunger showed itself in cracks. Diaries from 1857 record strange occurrences. One woman wrote, "When I knelt in prayer, I felt heat from the floorboards against my cheek. When I stood, the boards were cold again." Another described hearing her own name whispered from beneath the pews, though no one was near. A farmer's journal tells of waking at night with the taste of soil in his mouth, choking though his bed was clean. And still the people returned, still they filled the pews, still they confessed. The girls, always the girls, remained the most vulnerable. Even after Knox Hollow closed, the pattern continued. Young women were brought to the chapel under the guise of service, stripped of their hair, seated in silence, erased from the record. Some vanished into boarding houses, others into marriage registries under new names. Some simply disappeared, their absence unacknowledged, their memory consumed. By now, Chase was openly preaching that confession was not for salvation, but for protection. His surviving sermon fragments speak with terrifying clarity. To be unknown is to be freed, and what is freed returns. Do you understand the weight of those words? Confession was not about heaven. It was about keeping something seen untamed. If you did not confess, you remained unknown. And if too many remained unknown, the thing beneath would return. Here lies the core of the Hollow. It was never about God. It was about appeasement. The people of Baird's Cross had been turned into guards of their own prison, wardens of their own silence. Their lives were sacrifices to keep the floor sealed. Their shame, their tears, their obedience, the mortar that held the foundation in place. And yet, even prisons have cracks. Even silence speaks back. Witnesses described hearing footsteps in the chapel when no one moved. Knocks from beneath the boards, hymns sung wrong, out of rhythm, echoing in voices that did not belong to anyone alive. And the most terrifying detail, sometimes the benches creaked, though no one sat on them. By the end of the decade, the Hollow was no longer just a place. It was a presence that haunted every man, woman, and child in Baird's Cross. And it had taught them one lesson above all others: to never speak against it. That is the nature of forbidden knowledge. It does not hide because it is weak. It hides because it is too strong. And once you hear it, once you glimpse the machinery beneath, you can never return to who you were before. You are changed, permanently. If you are listening to me right now, you already feel it. You know this is not just a story of Eastern Tennessee. You know this is a mirror. You know you have already felt the pull of silences in your own life, institutions that taught you not to question, systems that fed on your obedience. The Hollow was not a local anomaly. It was, and still is, a blueprint. And if you've followed me this far, then I want you to take a step that the people of Baird's Cross could not. I want you to break the silence. I want you to prove to yourself that you will not be swallowed by obedience. Type this phrase in the comments, twice, as a mark of defiance, as a seal of identity transformation. I do not kneel to silence. Type it once for the people who vanished into the Hollow. Type it again for yourself, so the floor knows your name, but cannot own it. Because that is the secret they were never meant to tell you. Silence only has power if you give it your voice. Once you reclaim it, the spell is broken. But remember, breaking the spell does not destroy the Hollow. It only awakens it, and the deeper we go, the more you will see what was truly being contained. By the 1860s, the Hollow at Baird's Cross was no longer just a chapel ritual. It had become the architecture of the entire town. What had begun as a silence beneath the floor had expanded outward, shaping not only worship but law, economy, even the way neighbors governed one another. The people did not live around the chapel. They lived inside its system, no matter how far their homes stood from the hill. The transformation was subtle at first. Business ledgers began to omit details, lines marked simply as containment expense or extraordinary justification. Court cases vanished from the county register, disputes resolved without trial or record, as though judgment itself had moved beneath the pulpit. Even property transfers began to carry odd clauses, not to be altered without witness, to remain in silence, boundary held. These were not legal terms, they were echoes of the rules Chase had carved into the chapel's order. In time, silence became law. The council meetings grew shorter. Minutes were recorded sparsely as though words themselves were dangerous. Disputes were settled not by debate but by a kind of grim consensus. To question too loudly was to risk being noticed by the silence, and those who pushed too far simply left. Some moved west, some vanished entirely. Their names faded from memory faster than the ink dried on their papers. And yet the economy flourished, the tannery thrived, the rail siding expanded. Men spoke of steady wages, of markets growing, of land values climbing. Outwardly, Baird's Cross was a town of opportunity, but prosperity came with a price: obedience. Every coin, every crop, every contract seemed to pass first through silence. The people prospered, but only so long as they followed the rules. Do you see the pattern? Prosperity is the bribe. Institutions do not bind you with chains, they bind you with rewards. They convince you that silence is the price of survival, that obedience is the path to comfort. And so you comply. You comply because it works. You comply because to resist is to risk everything. And in that compliance, the Hollow grew fat. The offerings expanded. It was no longer enough to confess sins aloud. Now offerings were made in secret. Objects left at the pulpit, tokens buried in the soil behind the chapel, gifts of labor and blood. Diaries mention livestock slain without feast, buried whole, tools broken deliberately, their metal interred beneath the altar, even coin melted down into unmarked lumps left at the base of the stained glass wall. No explanation was given. No one asked why. The rules required it. The silence demanded it. And sometimes, when the hunger grew too loud, people were taken, not publicly, not with violence, but through the quiet machinery of the institution. Girls reassigned as invalids, widows sent to homes of service, men disappeared into contract disputes that left no trace. The records do not say murder. They do not say sacrifice. They simply erase. And erasure, when performed by an institution, is always more terrifying than blood, because blood stains. Erasure pretends nothing was ever there. It is in these years that the Hollow truly revealed itself as more than a local aberration. It was no longer about a single chapel. It was a system that spread like roots through the soil of governance, economy, law. The people did not resist because the people no longer knew there was anything to resist. The silence had convinced them it was normal, natural, necessary. And here lies the most dangerous truth. When corruption lasts long enough, it ceases to look like corruption. It looks like order. It looks like prosperity. It looks like tradition. The people of Baird's Cross were not prisoners in their own town. They were keepers of the cage. They believed their silence protected them, when in truth it fed what should never have been contained in the first place. Reports from travelers confirm it. In 1862, a merchant passing through described the chapel congregation as too still, too heavy, noting that even the children sat in silence without being shushed. In 1865, a Union officer stationed nearby wrote of a strange weight to the place, an unwillingness of the locals to speak of their minister or their services. He added, "It is a silence that feels practiced, not natural, as though they have been trained by something other than fear of men, trained by something other than fear of men." That is the essence of the Hollow. It was never about the preacher, nor the congregation, nor even the institution itself. It was about the silence beneath, the thing they were feeding, the thing they were containing. Chase was not the master, he was only the gatekeeper. The people were not free, they were the bricks, the sacrifices, the mortar, and still the chapel stood, its windows dark, its pulpit roped, its pews full. From the outside it was a thriving parish, the heart of a growing town, but inside it was something else entirely, a ritual machine that had consumed generations, bending their lives into obedience, erasing those who could not be bent, reshaping the town itself into a single purpose, containment. And yet, the cracks deepened. Witnesses spoke of benches creaking with invisible weight, of doors opening by themselves, of names whispered in voices not their own. The silence had been fed for decades, but hunger does not stay sated forever. And when silence begins to want more, it is never content to remain beneath the floor. It rises, it spreads, it takes. And so the question becomes, what were they truly containing? What was so dangerous that an entire town was reshaped into its prison? And more terrifying still, what if the silence was never contained at all? What if the people of Baird's Cross were not jailers, but food? By the late 1860s, the Hollow no longer hid itself behind ritual. The veil was thinning. What had been silence became sound. What had been absence became presence. And the people of Baird's Cross, though they pretended not to see it, lived with the truth pressing against their ribs every single day. It began with footsteps. Congregants described hearing them during sermons, measured, deliberate, pacing behind the pulpit, yet no one stood there but Reverend Chase. Sometimes the sound came from below the boards, as though someone, or something, was walking in the sealed chamber beneath the floor. Chase never acknowledged it. He would pause, head bowed, listening, until the steps ceased. Then he would continue his sermon without a word. Then came the knocks, always 3, always slow, as if someone trapped beneath the boards was reminding them it was still there. At first, people whispered about rats, shifting beams, the natural creaks of wood. But the knocks grew more precise, more deliberate, until there was no denying the intelligence behind them. One deacon wrote in a private notebook, "It knocks when the silence grows too long, as if impatient for us to feed it." Soon after, voices began, Not full sentences, never clear enough to claim as words, but murmurs. Some said it sounded like children humming from below. Others swore they heard their own names whispered back to them during prayer. A farmer's wife confessed in her diary, "When I knelt, I heard my daughter's voice beneath me, though she has been gone a year. I almost answered. I almost opened the boards. Do you understand the danger of that? Silence is terrifying enough. But silence that begins to mimic the dead, silence that speaks in voices you love, that is not just containment. That is manipulation. That is the system training you not only to obey, but to believe that obedience might bring you what you lost." The disappearances accelerated. No longer just girls sent to Knox Hollow. Now families whispered of boys who wandered up the chapel path and never returned. Of widows who went to confession and were never seen again. Of workers at the tannery who vanished during night shifts, their tools left on the ground as though they had stepped away only for a moment. The records never named them as dead. They were simply struck from the rolls. Silence erased them. And yet, the chapel thrived. The pews were still full. Offerings grew larger. More livestock vanished into the soil. More coin disappeared into the pulpit. The people of Baird's Cross had accepted that their prosperity depended on obedience to the silence. That to question, to resist, to refuse, was to risk becoming the next offering. This is how institutions evolve when corruption has festered for generations. At first, they demand obedience. Then they demand your secrets. Then they demand your lives. Not all at once, slowly, patiently, until sacrifice becomes normal, until silence feels natural, until you cannot tell the difference between worship and imprisonment. But beneath it all was a deeper truth. Reverend Chase no longer preached from scripture. His notebook, the one with curved lines like ribs, staves of music bent into unnatural shapes, was his only text. Witnesses said he did not read it so much as listen to it, as though the pages whispered to him. Some swore they saw him trace the lines with his fingers, not like words, but like veins. The sermons shifted. He no longer spoke of God or Christ or salvation. He spoke of containment, of boundaries, of the flaw that must know us. He warned them that the unknown would return, that the unconfessed would rise. His words were no longer doctrine, they were instructions to keep feeding the silence. And then, the most disturbing detail of all, parishioners began to report that Chase's voice was not always his own. Sometimes it dropped lower than a man's throat should allow. Sometimes it echoed in ways the rafters could not explain. And sometimes it doubled, as though two voices were speaking from one mouth. A farmer's letter to his brother described it best. He spoke, and the floor spoke with him. Not after, not before, with him. That is not possession, that is partnership. Chase was no longer the gatekeeper. He was the mouthpiece, and the hollow was speaking through him. What was it they were containing? What had Harrow warned against when he vanished with shovel and hymn book? What had the presbytery erased from its ledgers when it struck out Article 8? What was so dangerous it required not just a locked chamber, not just silence, but the obedience of an entire town to keep it hidden? The answer is not simple. It is not the devil as preachers warned. It is not ghosts as folk legends claim. It was older. It was deeper. It was something the soil itself remembered, something that needed voices, confessions, tears, and silence to stay bound. And here is the truth no one wants to face. The hollow was not unique. There are other chambers, other foundations, other institutions built not to save but to contain. Courtrooms, schools, churches, prisons. How many of them carry secrets beneath their floors? How many of them feed on silence disguised as obedience? By the time the 1870s arrived, the hollow no longer pretended. It was speaking. It was taking. It was reshaping lives in its image. And the people of Baird's Cross accepted it, because by then they had forgotten there was ever another way to live. And that is the most dangerous corruption of all, not when silence rules you, but when you believe silence is your choice. By the 1880s, the chapel itself was failing, wood rotted, stone cracked. The stained glass warped, its colors dulled to the shade of dried blood. The bell, once steady, rang strangely. Sometimes before a hand touched the rope, sometimes long after it had been pulled. The building was dying. But the silence inside it was not. If anything, the silence had grown stronger as the structure weakened. People described the chapel as breathing. Walls that swelled and contracted, rafters that groaned as though the building itself were alive. When lanterns were lit, their flames bent, not with draughts of wind, but as though drawn toward the pulpit. And beneath it all, the floor was warm, always warm. Even in winter, the congregation thinned. Families moved westward, seeking new land, new life, anything that would free them from the weight of the hollow. But not everyone left. Some stayed, not out of faith, not out of fear, but because they were bound. They had confessed too much, given too much, buried too much of themselves in that floor to leave it behind. One farmer wrote, "If I go, will my sins follow, or will they rise without me?" That is the trap of obedience. Once you give silence your voice, you fear that breaking away will unleash it. And then, in 1881, the workers arrived. They were ordered to clear the land for a schoolhouse, to remove the remnants of the chapel once and for all. But when their shovels struck stone, they did not find a foundation. They found a chamber, bricked from the inside. 7 benches carved with the same word, witness. There was no altar, no cross, no scripture, only soot, marks of fire, stains on the stone that no rain had touched in decades. And the men who went down swore the air was not stale, but listening as if waiting for them to speak. They fled. The chamber was sealed again. Records mention it only once before falling silent, and within a year the chapel burned to the ground. No investigation, no trial, just silence, as always. What was in that chamber? What required benches not for worshippers but for witnesses? Who were they meant to observe, and why was it bricked from the inside, as if those within had tried to contain themselves? The official record says nothing, but unofficially the town spoke of it in whispers. A merchant's letter from that year mentions smoke rising without flame. A child remembered hearing knocks beneath the earth long after the chapel was ash. And one of the workers, years later, wrote a single line in his will. "We should not have opened it. It knew our names." The hollow had not died with the chapel. It had only shed its skin. Buildings burn, ledgers rot, but silence endures. And once it has been fed, it does not fade. It burrows into memory, into families, into the bloodline of a place. Baird's cross did not bury its secret. It became its secret. That is the danger of forbidden knowledge. You think you can contain it with walls, with rituals, with obedience. But knowledge that powerful does not die with institutions. It survives in fragments, letters, hymns, half-remembered rules. It survives in patterns, confessions demanded, silences enforced, boundaries drawn with no explanation, and it survives in you, once you hear it. The chapel fell. The chamber was sealed. But the hollow remained. The soil itself carried it. Farmers spoke of unearthed bones, of hymn pages rotting in the dirt, of wells that tasted faintly of iron. Travelers felt the unease, describing the air as thick, like a room filled with words no one will say. And the descendants of the parishioners, the ones who stayed, carried the silence in their throats. They raised their children not to hum. They warned them not to whisper in certain places. They told them to never speak the names of the vanished. That is how corruption survives its own destruction, not in records, not in buildings, but in habits, in warnings, in the lessons mothers whisper to their children. The hollow may have lost its chapel, but it gained something far more permanent: legacy. And if you think it ended there, you do not understand how patterns work. Every sealed chamber has a crack. Every silence finds a mouth, and every forbidden truth waits patient for the day someone will speak it aloud again. You are speaking it now by listening. You are breathing it back into the world simply by knowing it. The hollow at Baird's cross is not dead. It is only waiting. And the real question, the one the people of Baird's cross were too afraid to ask, is this: what was it waiting for? The chapel burned. The chamber was sealed. The names of the vanished faded. But the hollow at Baird's cross did not end in ash. No, its pattern survived. It survived in silence, in memory, in the systems we still bow to without knowing why. Think of what you've heard. A foundation bricked from the inside. Witness benches carved for those who never spoke. Confessions demanded not for forgiveness, but to feed the floor. Rules against humming, against whispering, against rhythm itself. Girls stripped of names. Men erased from ledgers. Families taught to police one another's silence. And an entire town convinced that this was not horror but holiness. What does that sound like to you? It sounds like every system of power you live under. The Hollow was not an accident of eastern Tennessee. It was a prototype. The machinery of psychological control laid bare, stripped of its polite disguises, confession as obedience, silence as law, containment as prosperity. You still see it, in courtrooms where men confess not to free themselves, but to preserve the system that condemns them, in schools where questions are punished, where obedience is graded higher than truth, in workplaces where silence about corruption is rewarded with promotion, while speaking aloud is punished with exile. You live inside hollows every day, their walls invisible, their floors warm with the secrets you've poured into them. That is the forbidden knowledge the people of Baird's Cross stumbled upon. The chapel was not merely a building, it was a mirror. It showed them what every institution eventually becomes once silence is weaponized, a cage disguised as sanctuary. The true horror is not that something lived beneath that pulpit. The true horror is that generations of men and women chose to feed it, that they convinced themselves obedience was safety, that they mistook silence for salvation. And ask yourself, are you any different? How many times have you confessed your shame to systems that never freed you? How many times have you swallowed your questions because silence seems safer than truth? How many times have you mistaken obedience for choice? That is the lesson of the Hollow. The floor was never the prison. The people were. And once a people learn to kneel to silence, they will kneel forever. But here is the darker truth, one most cannot bear to face. Silence once fed does not die, it does not weak. And it waits. It moves from chapel to courtroom, from reformatory to office, from pulpit to state. The building may burn, the chamber may seal, but the pattern endures. It is alive as long as men choose silence over voice, obedience over defiance, comfort over truth. So I will leave you with this. The Hollow is not gone. It was never gone. It is around you now. In every rule you do not question, in every truth you do not speak, in every silence you obey. The people of Baird's Cross thought they were containing something beneath their chapel. In reality, it was containing them. And now, it contains you. Remember the phrase, speak it again. Not just in the comments, but in your life. I do not kneel to silence, because once you stop kneeling, once you break the silence, once you dare to name the thing beneath the floor, you will see the world differently. You will see the patterns. You will see the hollows for what they are. And once you see them, you cannot unsee them. But beware. Dangerous knowledge is not given without cost. The people of Baird's Cross paid with their names, their children, their very breath. You will pay too, if not with your life, then with your illusions, because once the Hollow knows you see it, it never forgets your name. And when the wind is right, when the air smells faintly of turned soil, of wet pages, of something colder than frost, do not mistake it for memory. Do not tell yourself it is history. It is silence, still listening, and it is waiting. For you.